Hello students, today we will be discussing about a new concept called Cold War which has influenced the post Second World War international relations in a very significant way. So, we will start with this. First we will discuss the background of Cold War, then we will discuss the salient features of Cold War, then we will discuss what are the reasons for Cold War through various theoretical lenses. Then we will also focus that why the Cold War was not a hot war. So, let us start with the background of Cold War. The Cold War was the most important feature of international politics in the second half of the 20th century. So, just after the Second World War, the ideological rivalry between the two superpowers started, and this now dominated the international system for almost 4.5 decades. The concept originated shortly after the end of the Second World War in 1946, and it is generally credited to Walter Lippmann, who has coined the term Cold War, and it emerged as a public political term in 1947 and has been widely used ever since. So, the whole concept of Cold War, it is not just an ideological rivalry between the two superpowers, rather it has gained a kind of conceptual framework to understand the post Second World War developments in international relations. Despite being a specific term used to describe 4.5 decades of confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, the term did not end with the end of the rivalry between the two superpowers. As I said, the ideological rivalry between the United States and Soviet Union might have ended, but the whole mentality of Cold War, the whole concept of Cold War, the whole understanding of Cold War is still valid in international relations. Instead, it is often used to describe other similar international phenomena due to its rich international political meaning and the reflection of new international relations in the nuclear arena. So, it is not that the one Cold War has ended, that has invalidated the concept of Cold War. So, the concept of Cold War is still prevalent in international politics. So, sometimes they criticize other states, other states decision makers for Cold War mentality, or thinking of a new Cold War. So, the whole concept of Cold War is still used in international politics. So, it is not just the end of the ideological rivalry between the two superpowers has made it outdated. For instance, since 2018, China and the United States are engaged in an increasingly fierce strategic competition in the economic and security spheres, leading many to presume that it may evolve into a new Cold War between the two major powers. So, if you look at the trade dispute between the United States and the Chinese, or if you look at the similar kind of competition between them in the security sphere, so that in a way has raised the conceptual value of the Cold War, and some people also describe this is a kind of new Cold War between the two major world powers. Second, although the conflict did not drive all aspects of international relations, its impact could be felt in every corner of the globe. So, there may be a situation that Cold War has affected some aspects of international politics, but no part of the world was immune from the Cold War politics, or no continent was immune from Cold War politics. Finally, and more importantly, Cold War created rivalries and political fault lines that continue to shape international relations for many years to come, even after the conflict ended. As I said, the impact of Cold War was so powerful that even if the Cold War ended, the impact of Cold War affected all aspects of international politics, affected all aspects of the functioning of international organizations. It affected many mainstream theories, it led to many critical theoretical perspectives. So, its impact was enormous in not just understanding the way international politics function, but it had substantial influence on various issues in international relations, on the important concepts we use in international relations, on the theoretical formulations, and also most importantly it is still used as a kind of conceptual framework to understand the power competition, maybe trade competition, maybe military competition, maybe competition in other areas as a new concept in international politics. Let us now discuss about the important features of Cold War. As a concept opposite to a hot war, Cold War does not mean complete peace. So, if you say that Cold War means there was overall peace all over the world, so that is not a correct understanding, because it is not just exactly opposite to hot war. A Cold War includes three important features. First, there must be two well matched power poles in the international system, because it is difficult for unbalanced power poles or more than two power poles to give rise to a Cold War. So, if there is no two power blocks, so it is difficult to characterize that period as Cold War. So, for Cold War to operate in international politics, we need at least two power poles or two well matched power blocks. Secondly, two major power blocks must mainly be competitive, not partners. So, the second feature of Cold War is when there are two competing power blocks, they should compete against each other at the international politics, and if they are partners, we cannot call them as Cold War countries are using Cold War as a kind of international concept. So, if there are two ideological competing power blocks, their rivalry should be highly competitive. So, you cannot say or characterize the relationship between India and America at the present time as a kind of Cold War, because for Cold War you should be a competitor, or you should compete against each other, maybe on ideological grounds, maybe on political issues, maybe on military issues. So, any kind of partnership between two important countries cannot be characterized as Cold War. Specifically, the competitive relationship between the two countries must be reflected in diplomatic confrontation through alliances, mutual military deterrence and arms races, economic closure and isolation, and ideological rivalry. So, the point is we can characterize the competitive relationship between two military rivals or two militarily powerful countries if they have diplomatic confrontation through alliances, military alliances, and there is a mutual military deterrence, and they are engaged in arms race, and also there is economic closure and isolation against each other, and also there is ideological rivalries between the two countries. So, the point is if these are the conditions, or if these conditions are present, then we can characterize the relationship between these two countries or any two countries as a kind of Cold War relationship. Third, there must not be direct military conflict between the two power blocks. So, if there is a direct military conflict, then it's not Cold War, rather it is a hot war. So, these are the three important conditions, or you can say these are the three important features that help us to understand the kind of rivalry between two power blocks, or help us to understand the competition between two important power blocks. A common form of conflict in a Cold War is proxy war, which is the main form of competition between the two opposite power blocks. So, the major powers or the superpowers, they were never engaged in a kind of hot war, rather whenever there was a situation, whenever there was a need, they engaged each other through proxy war. These three basic features, with the first describing the power structure and the two other features describing the state of the polar relationship, constituted the basic characteristics of the international system amid the US Soviet confrontation. So, so these two three important features, the first described about the power structure, and the other two described the kind of bipolar relationship. These three constituted the kind of Cold War that we witnessed between the United States and Soviet Union in the post Second World War period. Now, let us discuss what were the main causes that were responsible for the Cold War between the two superpowers, and there are different theoretical perspectives, or what we can say different theoretical lenses that help us to understand reasons for this kind of ideological rivalry or military confrontation between the two superpowers. So, now let us begin with the question that what were the causes of Cold War the answer to this complex question depends on which theory we can use and which assumptions we can make. So, there are not a single theory, not a single reason for start of Cold War between the two superpowers, rather there are multiple reasons and there are multiple theoretical lenses that will help us to understand the outbreak of Cold War between the two superpowers who collaborated with each other during the Second World War, but what happened or what are the reasons that led them to fight an ideological rivalry and military confrontation against each other in the post Second World War period. For realist theory, the answer lies in the power vacuum in the international system after 1945. So, if we look at the realist point of view or realist theories point of view, then basically they focus on the issue of power vacuum that occurred in the international system after 1945. Prior to World War II, both the United States and the Soviet Union were significant powers, but neither was dominant nor they were interested in projecting their power beyond their traditional borders. So, before the Second World War, America was virtually following the policy of isolationism, and the USSR was busy in consolidating its communist state after the communist revolution in that country in 1917. So, they were basically busy in their own matters, they were busy in their own issues, and whatever they did that within the border. So, they were not basically projecting power in the sense we understand from realist perspective beyond their borders. Germany, Britain, France and Italy, they were all major powers with expansive international interest and considerable military force before World War II. In fact, this can be understood as some of the major reasons for the beginning of Second World War. But the calamity of World War II destroyed the basis of the state's power and created a kind of power vacuum filled by the largely intact United States and a battle damaged but militarily dominant power called Soviet Union. So, these all important and powerful countries, those who constituted a multipolar kind of world before Second World War. So, they were badly damaged due to the Second World War, both economically, militarily. So, they lost millions of soldiers and they were badly devastated, and that is how there was a kind of power vacuum, because almost United Kingdom played a kind of balancer in the international system till the Second World War, but it also lost many of its colonies, and they themselves were very powerless and they were badly damaged because of the Second World War, and this kind of situation created a kind of power vacuum in the international politics, and this power vacuum was filled by the largely intact United States. And although Soviet Union also suffered losses during the Second World War, but anyway it was militarily dominant and there was no doubt about it. So, the point is since there was a vacuum in the international system, since there was a military vacuum in the international system, so that vacuum has to be filled, and these two countries, the USA which used nuclear bombs against Japan twice, and it was not badly damaged in the Second World War. So, that was the reason why it was mainly intact, and it has not suffered the kind of damage the other European countries they suffered. That created a kind of power vacuum which helped these countries, two countries, to fill that power vacuum, and that is one of the reasons why there was Cold War. So, the Cold War was a product of inescapable working of international system, where you find major powers are compelled to expand their interest or fall prey to others who have expanded. So, the Cold War created a kind of international system that forced the major countries either to expand their horizon or expand their interest, or they will simply follow the two superpowers who were leading their respective blocks. So, that kind of international structure actually helped the two superpowers to emerge as two important superpowers of that time, and other powers basically followed their leadership, or they allowed them to be led by these two superpowers. In Western Europe, there was no dominant power, and thus the system induced American and Soviet rivalry. So, because almost all European countries, they were badly damaged due to the Second World War. So, it was almost a kind of power vacuum in the Western Europe, and this power vacuum in the Western Europe helped these countries or provided a kind of conducive environment for these two countries to emerge and to lead the European countries or provide leadership to these European countries, and that is how the Cold War started between these two superpowers. So, the Cold War went global because there was decolonialization that provided further opportunities to both the superpowers to compete for or bringing the newly independent countries of Africa, Asia and Latin America into their fold, and so ideology has nothing to do with Cold War. So, that is basically the argument of realist. So, if you want to understand the origin of Cold War or the major reason for the beginning of Cold War, so it is basically the power vacuum created with the declining of the European countries or major European countries and the emergence of two superpowers. There is another theory called liberalism that also explains the emergence of Cold War between the two superpowers. So, according to liberalism, the international system has nothing to do with the emergence of Cold War. Rather, we can attribute the constituent states for the emergence of the Cold War between the two superpowers. While the liberals do not deny the importance of military rivalry, they look to ineffective policies, misperceptions and miscommunication between the two countries that helps us to explain the conflict. So, the Cold War started not because of the international system, rather it is because of the ineffective policies, misperceptions and miscommunication between the political elites in the United States and Soviet Union. So, that may be considered as a major reason for the beginning of Cold War. When realists see conflict as inevitable, liberals see it as a contingent on specific action. So, they do not give a general cause to Cold War, rather there are specific reasons, there are specific factors that help us to understand the beginning of Cold War between the two superpowers. The Cold War was not caused by a power vacuum, rather it was the product of diplomatic blundering and misunderstanding. So, in this Cold War, so there is no role of international structure or international power structure, although the liberals accept the importance of military power, but at the same time they think that it is not because of power vacuum, rather it was a kind of diplomatic misunderstanding or diplomatic blundering. So, both the superpowers, they blundered in missing opportunities for peace and cooperation, and so we can't blame only this side or that side for the Cold War, rather both the superpowers, they were responsible for Cold War, and the escalating misperception created a mentality of bombs, dollars and doctrines that made mutual suspicion and ingrained hostility seem unavoidable. So, it is because of all these reasons misperception and misunderstanding that created a kind of bomb culture, arms race, nuclear deterrence. So, rivalry was not inevitable, but was a product of a mutual sense of insecurity that could have been resolved. So, it is not something structural or the international structure compelled them to compete, rather it was a kind of mutual sense of insecurity that actually could have been resolved had there been better diplomatic understanding and better kind of cooperation between the two superpowers. Improved communication and better understanding of other side's intentions and concerns could have produced a workable and cooperative international system and a much more peaceful post-war setting. So, if both the superpowers had cooperated with each other, or they had worked in many areas of international cooperation, that could have produced a more workable and cooperative international system and a more peaceful second world order. Basically the liberals differ from the realists on the issue of the role of international power structure or power vacuum. An alternative version of Cold War basically focuses on the role of ideology as the main reason that forced the two superpowers to ideologically compete against each other. In this view, the Cold War was essentially an expression of the global ideological rivalry between capitalism and communism that emerged in the 19th century, but assumed more concrete form after the Russian Revolution of 1917. So, these two ideologies, they emerged in different periods of history, but the rise of capitalism in the 19th century and the communist revolution in Russia in 1917, these two factors were the major reasons for the Cold War. In the West, the concept of a market economy and multi-party democracy were cherished. So, if you look at the West, not only the market economy is considered something as a virtue, rather there is multi-party system, democratic system operating in those countries, and that was opposed to the kind of communist system the Soviet Union had. In the East, single party system and a command economy were highly valued. So, the obvious conflict of ideas and the nature of the persons, particularly those who provided leadership to these two countries in the post Second World War period, they were the major reasons behind this conflict. So, those who interpret the Cold War or those who consider ideology as the major reason for Cold War, they consider these two opposite ideologies. On the one hand you have capitalism, on the other hand you have communism, and the leaders, particularly those who believed in these ideologies and those who provided the kind of guidance and leadership to these countries in the post Second World War period. So, mainly they were responsible for the Cold War. So, the Cold War was therefore a battle between the two different ideologies. On the one hand you have capitalist West and the communist East. So, the USA and the Soviet Union, they were merely the instruments through which it was fought. So, the major powers, they had no role, rather it was the ideology that forced them to engage against each other in a Cold War. Rather it was the two opposite ideologies that forced these two countries to ideologically compete against each other. So, the Cold War became inevitable once fascism had been vanquished in the post Second World War period, leaving global politics to be structured by the East-West ideological conflict. So, it was basically a kind of ideological rivalry, or these two ideologies helped the two superpowers to engage in an ideological rivalry against each other in the post Second World War period. There is another school that we can call as revisionist, who agree with the orthodox scholars about the nature of the Cold War, but they reverse the focus of the blame. So, both the revisionist and the orthodox scholars, particularly realists, they think about the nature of the Cold War in the similar way, but then they differ actually who is responsible for the Cold War. That is basically their differences. Revisionism became popular in the United States in 1960s, particularly during the Vietnam War, and it basically focuses on the power of the United States during and after 1945. For example, although the United States lost about 4 lakh lives during the Second World War, the USSR on the other hand lost 27 million lives. So, that shows how the USSR was more badly damaged than the USA. The American economy benefited from the war, while the Soviet economy was almost destroyed. So, in terms of economy, not just about the human death, if you compare also both the two superpowers, their economic benefit also was different, because America was highly benefited in the post Second World War economic system, and the Soviet economy, because it was directly involved in the Second World War, so its economy was almost destroyed. According to some other revisionists, Soviet behavior was merely a defensive attempt to build a legitimate security zone in the Eastern Europe, which was basically defensive rather than aggressive, and motivated essentially by the desire of a buffer zone between itself and the hostile West, and a wish to see permanently weakened Germany. Those who look at the cause of the Cold War or the origin of the Cold War, they look at the perspective of the USSR, that whatever USSR did in the beginning of the Cold War, either it is turning the Eastern Europe as a legitimate security zone that was basically built for defensive purposes rather than aggressive purposes. And in fact, if the Eastern Europe was made as a buffer zone, so that would have dealt with the hostile West in a very significant way, and in that way it also wanted to make Germany permanently weak by dividing that country, so that it will not be able to create another world war in the world. Whereas the United States was trying to reconstruct the international economic system for its own national interests. So, whatever the Americans did, either by establishing the Bretton Woods system led by the World Bank and IMF, so that the kind of military assistance, the economic assistance they provided to the countries of the West, so that was for their interest, and in seen from that perspective, Soviet Union was right to create a buffer zone in the Eastern Europe to deal with the hostile West. So, that was basically the rationale given from the USSR perspective. In short, the Cold War was a period of American dominance whose legitimacy was based on a mythical Soviet threat. So, the revisionists who understand the Cold War from USSR perspective, they think that the whole concept of Soviet threat was manufactured, rather it was created, it was manufactured by the Americans, by the American allies, compete against USSR, damage its reputation and standing in the international politics. So, it was a manufactured threat, it was a kind of mythical threat that was used to justify American dominance in international politics in the post Second World War period. In contrast to the view that the Cold War was inherently antagonistic, regardless of who was the main instigator, an opposing school of thought suggests that the Cold War was in retrospect very useful for both the sides. So, taking a very different kind of position from the revisionist, this kind of view suggests that it is not just the USA got the benefit or USA got all the benefits, rather it was equally beneficial for both the superpowers. For the United States, it solved the problem of what to do about Germany and Japan, both of whom were the key states responsible for the Second World War. So, because there was a Cold War, so in a way this Germany was divided and Japan was forced to be peaceful, so this in a way dealt with the US dilemma in dealing with these two important countries, those who were responsible for the Second World War. For the Soviet Union and the United States combinedly together, the Cold War permitted a de facto kind of solution to the Germany problem by freezing the social and political contours of Europe both in the East and the West. So, the division of Germany as East Germany and West Germany actually helped the USSR to keep its western flank on its side, and the Americans they were able to retain their control in the western part of Europe. The perpetuation of the Cold War was also useful for maintaining a strict nuclear hierarchy between the two superpowers and their allies. So, the nuclear arms race, the nuclear factor that significantly influenced the Cold War operation, that also helped the two superpowers to maintain a kind of nuclear hierarchy or the hierarchy in the world between them and their allies, and also the nuclear states and non-nuclear states. So, it was a kind of hierarchy that helped both the superpowers to retain preeminent position on the nuclear issue and the nuclear hubs and the nuclear hub nuts on the other hand. So, it was also beneficial to both the superpowers to retain their monopoly over nuclear issues. The theoretical possibility of nuclear conflict subordinated the actual conflicts within the respective blocs to the interest of global stability ensured by both the superpowers. So, the nuclear factor also helped in other ways, because the fear of nuclear war, the fear of nuclear conflict subordinated the actual conflicts within the respective blocs, and it in a way helped them to maintain global stability by the two superpowers. Finally, powerful domestic interest on each side was sustained by the Cold War. For example, within the United States, the arms race strengthened what is called the military industrial complex, and justified intervention abroad, facilitated the establishment of a national security state, and elevated the presidency over other institutions of US federal government. For example, within the United States, an arms race strengthened what you can call as the military industrial security complex. In the name of Cold War, USA justified its intervention abroad. It also facilitated the establishment of national security state, where individual freedom was compromised in the name of national security, and elevated the power of the president in the division of power between different organs of the government, and it elevated the power of the president vis-a-vis Congress and the Supreme Court. So, the point is it was equally beneficial to both the superpowers, and America got the benefit in this way. What about the USSR? So far as the USSR was concerned, the Cold War justified domestic repression, subordinated the civilian to the military sectors of the society, and maintained an authoritarian system of government founded on the demands of geopolitical catch-up. So, it was equally beneficial to the USSR because the Cold War justified domestic repression in the communist country. It subordinated the civilian to the military sectors of the society and maintained an authoritarian kind of government that was always under the pressure to catch up with the United States. Although there is some truth in the main claims of all the schools of thought, they share a tendency to exaggerate the degree of coherence and foresight in the planning and implementation of foreign policy. So, we can't agree with this proposition that each of the theories or each of the theoretical perspective, whatever is their argument, they can singularly help us to understand the origin of the Cold War. Rather, there is a need to combine the main arguments of all the theories, because that will give us a comprehensive perspective about the origin of Cold War. Certainly, the Cold War arose out of the long period of geopolitical turmoil in Europe, whose internal conflicts eventually subordinated the continent to two extra European superpowers with very different social systems and little diplomatic familiarity with each other. So, there is no doubt that Europe, that dominated international politics for several hundred years, all of a sudden it was dominated by two extra European powers, one America and the USSR, and in a way these two countries they had no diplomatic familiarity with each other, and they were also having different types of ideologies. So, it is natural that the conflict was inevitable, and in a way it increased the ideological rivalry between the two superpowers because of mistrust, because of misunderstanding. Also, it should be remembered that as a period of history, the Cold War coincided with the onset of a nuclear era, and also due to decolonialization, both of which raised the stakes in the competition. So, so the nuclear factor, when America conducted one nuclear test, that was matched by two nuclear tests by the USSR. So, this kind of nuclear factor and also the decolonialization factor that was there after the Second World War, these two factors, they somehow raised the kind of competition or ideological rivalry between the two superpowers. However, despite all the factors that kept the superpowers apart from each other, they did serve some important common interest, because as we have seen in case of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, both the superpowers they wanted to avert a direct military conflict between the two superpowers. But despite the ideological rivalry between the two superpowers, they did share some common points, as we can see after the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, that in a way moderated their behavior, and that helped them to work on some important issues of mutual concern and mutual benefit. Now, the important question is why there was no hot war between the two superpowers despite their differences, despite their ideological rivalry. The division of Europe, arms control, the shared interest in ensuring that real wars in the third world would not lead to a direct conflict between the two superpowers, these all factors ensured a degree of moderation in the Cold War period between the two superpowers. So, there was not a single reason that explains the kind of moderation or the absence of a hot war between the two superpowers. Rather, there were multiple reasons, multiple factors that help to understand why there was not a hot war between the two parties. So, these factors helped a kind of stability and moderation in the relationship between the two superpowers. But now the question is, why did the United States and the Soviet Union avoid direct military conflict with each other? So, that is again an interesting question. There are so many reasons for this, and the first reason is that some point to good communication and effective diplomacy in times of crisis. As you can look at the time of Cuban Missile Crisis, there was better communication between the two superpowers, and there was also effective diplomacy. So, that in a way helped them to avert any kind of nuclear war or any kind of direct military conflict between the two superpowers. Others argue that it was their lack of physical proximity that keep the peace, because they were located geographically from several thousand kilometers or several thousand miles. So, that in a way prevented the two countries to avoid direct conflict between the two superpowers. Still others consider that peace between the United States and the Soviet Union was brought about by the nuclear weapon. So, there is no doubt about it that nuclear factor, or you can say the balance of terror, that in a way help the two superpowers to realize that if they go for a nuclear war, that was they will not only be destroyed, rather they will be able to destroy the whole world. So, the point is there is not a single reason that explains the absence of a hot war between the two superpowers. Rather, there are so many reasons like effective communication, good diplomacy, and the lack of physical proximity, and also the nuclear factor that help us to understand this question. So, thank you very much. We will continue our discussion on the Cold War, and until then, goodbye and thank you for your patient hearing.